I can look back at my community where I grew up, nobody's there anymore. And it's just because the city took off around us, and as that happened, the jobs don't pay enough to live here anymore. So what used to be a little tight-knit community, it's all gone.
So we're going to get right into this. I think when I started to frame out the discussion, it was really trying to get us to kind of get to the heart of our conversation. And so, as Erica has shared with you, we have an opportunity to think 100 years later about this story. And so Stephen took a lot of time and a lot of energy and sweat to give us this book, Dark Tide, to really help us understand what happened. What is the story of this molasses flood? Is it serious? Is it a joke? Is it scary? What is the meaning of the story now? And how could we actually spend some time tonight to really understand what this moment was? And we have this like tremendous eruption in the middle of the city, this tremendous moment to take notice in terms of what the city needed, the city's issues were. And in this book, Stephen does an incredible job, I think, of really framing Boston in the moment of 1919. What was the city like? What did the city need? What did the future seem like at that moment? Did it seem promising or grim? These are all questions that are really laid out very nicely in this narrative. And what I'm going to ask Stephen to do is to take us to this day, January 15th, 1919. You describe it as the day had been overcast a few days before, and at noon we have this moment. And so can you bring us to this moment of this story and just give us a sense of kind of what was that event that you help us understand?
Thanks, Carolyn. And by the way, I want to just echo, thank you guys for being here tonight. Cold night, winter night, great crowd, so thanks so much. Really appreciate it. It means a lot. And also a couple of you folks I talked to during the pregame show. And I appreciate your support and your purchasing of the books and all of that, so that was fun too. So the day, January 15th, 1919, it's about a 40-degree day. 2 days earlier, it had been about 2 degrees, so it's a January thaw, which we're all familiar with here in Boston. And there's a 50-foot tank on the Boston waterfront, Commercial Street waterfront in the North End, filled to capacity with 2.3 million gallons of molasses. We can get into what it's used for later, but just to keep you in the moment of the day, a Boston police patrolman by the name of Frank McManus is walking his regular beat down Commercial Street, and coincidentally enough is making his routine call on the call box back to Boston Police Headquarters, when he hears what he describes in court later as a tremendous rumbling, grinding sound and the rat-tat-tat of what sounds like machine gun fire. And he turns around and he sees this steel-plated tank splitting apart, and the rat-tat-tat is the thousands of rivets that are pulling away from holding it together, and it's disgorging its complete contents of molasses. And he has the presence of mind to make one of the most unbelievable calls back to Boston Police Headquarters. He says, "Send all available rescue personnel immediately. There's a wave of molasses coming down Commercial Street." So guarantee you they haven't had a call like that since. That is the official call. And the molasses comes very hard and very fast. So the phrase, "you're as slow as cold molasses in January," does come from this flood. But this molasses comes very hard, about 35 miles an hour at the outset, about 35 feet high at the outset. It levels off to about 20 feet high and 160 feet wide, and quite literally obliterates the North End Boston waterfront. Destroys buildings, destroys people, destroys horses, destroys carts and everything else you can imagine. 21 people killed, 150 people injured, some of them very, very seriously. The vast majority of those people are either Italian immigrants who are making deliveries to the North End waterfront at the time, or quite frankly, Irish city workers who are working at the North End paving yard, kind of a DPW yard, at the time. And the injuries they suffer, I think, are very harrowing: broken backs, broken pelvises, those sorts of things, fractured skulls. They get the debris that gets picked up, the molasses impact itself So as Carolyn mentioned, when you first hear about it, there's maybe just a little bit of disbelief, maybe even a little giggle. But I would say that the deaths and the injuries were terrible ways to die or get hurt. I talk about, in this one portion of the book, where firefighters get trapped underneath a crawl space. There's a firehouse about 80 feet from the tank. And when the wave slams into the firehouse, the second floor pancakes onto the first. And there are 4 firefighters trapped underneath. One of them, George Leahy, spends 4 hours trying to keep his head above molasses, and he's unable to do so. He ends up asphyxiating, drowning in molasses, right? So those are the kind of injuries we're talking about, including 2 10-year-old children who suffer the same fate. So that's the disaster scene as we know it that day, and we can get into some of the bigger issues around that after that. Yeah.
It's great. So such a gripping story, and I especially appreciate how this winds up being a story about the workers, right? The story of one of the main guys, Arthur P. Gell, someone who's so instrumental in trying to do the work of managing this colossal tank and what it meant for him and other workers in the North End, in downtown at this time. And so, Bob, I'm hoping you could just tell us a little bit, or give us a sense of, from a historical perspective, what are the lessons that we can take away from this event? What does it teach us, and how is it still speaking to us right now in 2019?
I wish the takeaway lesson was that people jumped to and began to actually care about workers being hurt. And the siting of these kinds of hazardous tanks and dumps and toxics not being put in the middle of neighborhoods anymore. But sadly, I think it took us a while. So for context, we don't have in this country a federal occupation safety and health administration until the 1970s, right? A federal level set of statutes to protect workers, and as well, a lot of the zoning and other things are a historical process over time. And we tend, I think, too quickly to, in the late 19th, early 20th century, when there are these industrial accidents or accidents related to industry, and this tank certainly fits that definition, the next day, too often, we, as a society, went about our own business and somewhat forgot about it. And so I liken this to just a quick story, and to frame it the way I think about it. In 1860, in Lawrence, not that far from where we are, a textile mill collapses. It's not a molasses tank, but it's a building, a textile mill that at about 4:30, 5 o'clock on a dark afternoon in January, literally tips over. It's been built with shoddy equipment, it's been built with shoddy bricks, shoddy beams holding the building up like this building's being held up now. It folds over on itself and it kills 110 immigrant workers. The very next year on the exact same site, that mill building, the Pemberton Mill is the name of the mill that collapses, on that very same site the mill is rebuilt, and the people that rebuild it salvage and use as many bricks and as much lumber as they possibly can from the building that caved in. The outpouring of support for the families of the 110 people who lose their lives is extraordinary. In the Lawrence History Center, there are all these records of donations that poured in from all over the country to support the families of these immigrant workers. After about 2 weeks of this money coming in, the mayor of Lawrence tells people not to send money anymore, because if they keep sending money, immigrants in Lawrence are going to get used to getting free stuff, and they're not going to want to go back to work. And so the aid is stopped. And we took our way forward to the Triangle Fire in 1912, the Molasses catastrophe, mine disasters, which we all know about in history. So I feel like we don't have the best possible record we could think of when it comes to actually quickly dealing with these sorts of serious disasters. This one's unique in a way because it impacts a neighborhood the way the mill collapse affected the mill and the people that worked in it. It didn't wipe out a neighborhood around it. So this one, I think, caused people to pay a bit more attention than they might have if otherwise.
And thank you for that. And so what we're talking about here is also an industrial history. And so if we think about this 1919 moment, we're talking about how Boston's economy was also integrated into a larger global economy in the North Atlantic. And so the story of how molasses even gets to be here is a question, and it raises up all these discussions around how we think about the triangular trade, how we think about slavery being implicated in the New England economy, and who are the workers that are actually powering this global economy at this moment of 1919. Fast forwarding to today, we're talking about a post-industrial economy. We're talking about a service-based economy where we have many workers that are still on the streets of Boston right now powering what makes our economy as hot, as dynamic, and as powerful as it is. Another kind of industrial story really is begging us the question of kind of where are we now? What are some of the lessons that we have learned from the experience of workers, the experience of the industrial production of molasses that are relevant to today? And I'm gonna ask Carlos to talk a little bit about kind of where do we stand in terms of workers who are so important in terms of powering Boston's ability to be inserted into a global economy. What are workers grappling with now, and are there any lessons or things coming out of this molasses flood story that you feel like are resonant for you today?
Yeah, so first I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and thank you for being invited to the panel as the 21st century guests. I guess that's who we are. You know, look, I think I have a couple of thoughts, and I do think it would be really interesting to hear from Courtney and her actual experience as a worker in the hotel industry here in Boston. But if you look at Boston's economy in the 21st century, it's really driven by the education industrial economy, right? There's a lot of educational institutions here that are expanding and growing their footprint. There's the hospital and medical industrial complex that's also sort of growing its footprint in significant ways. And there's finance capital as well. And one of the things that I think we've seen that brings these things together is the massive expansion of the service industry in the city of Boston. Because people come to conferences, people bring their kids to school, people are coming here as patients, people are coming here in many different ways and are taking advantage of the service sector economy, whether that's hotels, whether that's industrial food service, whether that's janitorial cleaning, you name it. The service economy is a major component, and it's one of the fastest job creating parts of the economy in the state and in this city. And I think there's an interesting trend, maybe it's not quite the same as molasses, but as there's been so much development in the city of Boston, so much sort of mixed use, high-priced condos, high-priced hotels, the economy of Boston has really heated up for individuals who can afford to stay and be participating and be part of that level and sector of the economy. But what does that do? Well, it pushes the workers, the very workers who are, either folks who have historically been the working class of the city of Boston or folks who are new immigrants who are coming in to the city of Boston further and further away, and creates a more and more contingent workforce. And so while I wouldn't say that there's like a spill of molasses happening, there's certainly a spill of private equity money, real estate investment trust money, and large-scale investment in the real estate economy and the adjunct industries, so the major industries in the city of Boston, that I think actually has a fairly serious impact on the lives and the families and the communities of the working people of the city of Boston. And for sure, our strike at Marriott, which went on for 46 days, was about one job being enough, right? That people should, that was the slogan, one job should be enough. One job should be enough to send your kids to school, to have a place to live, to be able to make ends meet. And that's not true anymore in the service economy. And so while a lot of money has been brought into the city, and you can just see it if I look at the skyscrapers, look at the skyline, look at the cranes in the sky, where's that money going and who's sharing in that wealth? That was the question that we were trying to ask.
Courtney, there's a segue right there for you. Would love to hear your perspective on being a frontline worker, but also an organizer, in terms of what you see in terms of shifts in the economy. But what are the needs of workers, and what can we do to really kind of lift up this offering that Carlos has for us in terms of this campaign around one job being enough? Like, what's your reflection on that from where you sit?
So being originally from South Boston, I was born and raised here. I can look back at my community where I grew up. Nobody's there anymore. And it's just because the city took off around us, and as that happened, the jobs don't pay enough to live here anymore. So what used to be a little tight-knit community, it's all gone. I lived here until I was 17, and then went out to Quincy, and then when I wanted to go to my own, I ended up in New Bedford. So I commute every day, about 5 hours a day, just to get back to the city that I'm from. So that was one of the big drivers for me for the one job should be enough. But I worked at the Western Waterfront for 7 years. I can see the room attendants in their 70s who are still working. I know some of my coworkers work 2, 3, some of them 4 jobs, just so their kids can have food at night. So getting everybody to come together, to go out, to kind of be like, we are the backbone of this city. We deserve to have one job should be enough. If you take us away, the city isn't anything. And while the corporations come in and make all the money and we have to struggle every night, it's just, we're tired of it. And you can see it happening, which is really exciting to see. We have people who are in schools, people who work in food, people who are in the service industry. They're all starting to say, we're tired of this. We are the ones that make the city what it is, and we just want our part of that. So I'm really proud to be part of this movement. It's very exciting. It would be nice to one day come back home. Hopefully that'll happen, but it's very exciting.
No, thank you. Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because I think what you lay out is a provocative narrative in terms of how the productivity of the city has shifted. Like, people are coming back to Boston to work and to live, but the city has definitely become more full with people, but also more full of economic activity that makes us harken back to this moment in 1919, where there was so much industrial and economic activity right here in downtown. The difference is that people were living nearby, workers were walking to work, and there was a different kind of geography, a different kind of organization around where people could live and work, and their affordability. And so for you to share your story of now living in New Bedford and having to commute so far every day to be able to participate in the economy is a siren call for us here, right? To say, okay, something is amiss here in terms of how we're organizing where people live and where they work. And also asking us the question of what kind of economy do we want to be producing, and how do we want to take responsibility for that as a set of residents, as a set of concerned citizens, investors, and all of that. So what I'm hoping is that maybe I can pivot back to Stephen, and can you share a little bit more on your outtakes in terms of the story of the Molasses flood and what we learned or what we've gotten right in the wake of that story? Is there any did we get any wake up calls that we were able to adopt or move forward on?
Yeah, I think we did. So if you look at the flood itself and then the court case that follows, there's an enormous civil lawsuit that follows. It takes about 6 years for it to be adjudicated, and it is adjudicated in favor of the plaintiffs, the 119 victims in the case, against the company that owns the tank, United States Industrial Alcohol, one of the largest industrial alcohol companies in America at the time. So when you think of industrial alcohol, think of dyes and lacquers and paint thinners and turpentine, things like that. But also, during the time of the Molasses flood, that industrial alcohol was further processed and used in the production of munitions, nitroglycerin, TNT, for World War I. Huge customers of U.S. industrial alcohol were the munitions companies, the French government, the British government before the U.S. gets into the war, and then the U.S. government after 1917. So if you look at that court case that gets adjudicated in 1925, I think it's the first major court decision that goes against a large U.S. corporation. And I think if you draw a line there and go forward to the late 20s after the stock market crash, into the early 30s, the early Roosevelt years for sure, there is this big change. There's a gigantic change in the influence of government over business. There are far more laws, regulations, those kinds of things, statutes, that come from this Molasses flood case, which is why I think it's such an important case. And I would say a subset of that is that almost every building construction standard that we take for granted today, that architects need to show their work, that engineers need to sign and seal their plans, that building inspectors need to come out, really starts as a result of the Molasses flood. It starts in Boston, it starts in Massachusetts, and ripples across the country. I mean, this tank didn't even require a building permit at the time because it was considered a receptacle and not a building, right? So that part I think has changed and has, I mean, you can argue that in the intervening decades, the pendulum swings one way too far or the other. I think that's a fair argument to have. But I would say that after the flood court case, that entire relationship between business and government does change. Government has far more to say over the way business operates. I think that's a safe thing to say.
And it seems like trying to think about the history and the long legacy of trade unionism, that it also elevates the conversation about workers and kind of what workers are doing directly to advocate for what they need and to kind of create new standards and new demands to make sure that the marketplace is responding. So on the one hand, we could talk about litigation or lawsuits and kind of changes in the building trades in terms of building specs and standards there. But I wonder, Carlos, could you talk to us a little bit about this most recent strike with Marriott and kind of what was on the table for workers and what were the wins, if there were any?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Marriott strikes, and like I said, the theme was we want one job to be enough, like one job should be enough. And some of that was just economics, right? That, wage increases, pensions, no increases to the cost of healthcare. On the other hand, some of that was about contingent work, some of that was about scheduling, some of that was about the way technology and the introduction of technology into our industries actually influences the ability for workers to get work at all, right? One of the things that has begun to happen in the service industry is that there's a lot of sort of technological innovation that's going on. A lot of companies are spending a lot of time thinking whether it's about platforms or whether it's about straight up robotics and replacement of workers, how can technological change lower labor costs in significant ways? And so one of the things that we actually won in our contract was pretty groundbreaking language around being able to negotiate over technology during the life of the contract. So you don't have to wait for the contract to expire to actually enter into meaningful negotiations. And also we have the ability not just to see what the company's proposals are for the kind of technological change they want, but to actually see third-party studies that are done. And so a lot of times what will happen is a company that's developing a new technology will give a study to the company saying, oh, you're gonna have a 50% cut in labor cost, but when they come and negotiate, they say, oh, it's gonna all be fine. We now get the right to see that. And the other thing that was of real significance on a national scale or international scale was protections around sexual harassment. And sexual harassment, Courtney can speak more about this because she was in Geneva, but it's a major problem in the hotel, hospitality, and the restaurant industry. And we won very significant protections, not just sort of the things that got in the press, like panic buttons for housekeepers and things like that, but actually more serious protections about both sexual harassment between workers, between managers, but also coming from the guests and the client base. So that was very significant.
That's great. And so on this point, in terms of kind of what it looks like on the global sort of union organizing scale in that context, I'm hoping, Bob, you could weigh in and give us a sense of kind of from your research and your analysis, what are you seeing in terms of trends in sort of union mobilizing? And I'm particularly struck by the fact that we're sitting here talking about the hotel and hospitality workers, often workers who are often paid the least, dismissed the first, don't always get to be at the bargaining table, and so really want to lift up and celebrate Local 26's work to kind of really elevate the bargaining position of so many workers who are important in that sector, but to also just tie it back to how does that resonate with what you've been seeing around the world?
So I think one of the things that has happened is a lot of what we think of now as dangerous work, as work with exposure to chemicals or work that involves dangerous machinery, where the federal and state governments instituted regulations and ways to measure and test and provide safeguards on machinery and things like that. What generally tended to happen, a lot of employers simply moved the work to a less developed country that hadn't elevated yet that same set of labor standards. So in the 1930s here, workers get the right legally to bargain over wages, hours, and conditions of employment. Conditions of employment is a big deal because that covers a multitude of things related to what we've been talking about all the way up through talking about the hotel work and the struggle with Local 26. But we're all aware, I'm sure, of garment factories overseas where there's a fire or a building collapse or what have you, or Nike is very famous for the sweatshops where it produces sneakers. And one of the biggest culprits, ironically enough today, are big colleges and universities that get all their logoed clothing from overseas sweatshops. And students are proud to wear, the sweatshirt of their alma mater or whatever, and yet when you actually get them, which I try to do with my students, look at the label, check the label, then they realize that dangerous work has been put somewhere else. So sometimes I feel like which Steve said, which is right, we're better at creating the regulatory infrastructure to try to make things safer, but we also provide escape hatches for people to try to figure out we'll just do that somewhere else. And that tends to happen too. So globally, there are a lot of conferences about trying to figure this stuff out globally, try to work against sweatshops. There's a large Students Against Sweatshop movement that's organizing globally. But it's still tough sledding because for a lot of people without work, even work that's dangerous is better, right? When you're weighing the options, it's better than no work at all. And so people can still get away with it.
Let's hold on to this theme a little bit in terms of sort of this conversation about how to kind of articulate what the needs are of workers, but also try to challenge and change the relationship between workers and employers, and trying to think about that on a global scale. Courtney, I'm wondering if you could weigh in a little bit on what your experience was like in Geneva, and also some of the issues that you see at the forefront right now.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to attend a conference in Geneva. There was hundreds of us from all around the world, and it was focused around sexual harassment in the workplace. The thing that struck me the most is no matter where you were from, we all had the exact same problems. And they were all met with management in the company telling us to basically, they're paying us to stay here, deal with it. And we were kind of sitting in the room and you're all talking, and some of us like, oh, well, my story's not as bad as her story, so I'm okay. Like, the fact that any of us would have that thought that, oh, this happened to me and it was bad, but it wasn't as bad as what happened to you, so I made out okay, is just horrible. Part of what we did in Geneva, we spent a whole day basically in a massive line marching through the city with signs basically calling out Marriott because they are the largest and the richest hotel company in the world. Change starts with you. We delegated 2 of their largest hotels. One was met with a GM that was very nice on the outside and invited us in and wanted to understand everything. And then we got to the second hotel where the manager wouldn't even let us in the building. So he would rather us all out on the street screaming at each other because he didn't want to hear it. He didn't think this was a problem. So there's literally a group of us on one side just trying to have a conversation about this is a real concern and this is happening everywhere and we could start the change now. And he wanted no part of it. We had the whole other congregation on the other side of the street because we were trying to be respectful of the hotel, which they clearly knew something was going on when we never went inside. So they all started going crazy. And his thing to us was, I'm just going to start yelling at you. So it's still a challenge, and it's a challenge that we shouldn't have. I should go to work and you should feel safe. Being a server, it's something that happens to you almost nightly, and it's a different scale, but it shouldn't matter. I can't imagine being a room attendant, being up in a room. You don't know if someone's in there, what can happen. I did room service for a while, and the stuff that happens when you go into rooms is ridiculous, and nobody wants to hear it. So it's time that changes, which is why winning what Carlos was saying in our contract fight about the protections around it is so huge for us. Something that we shouldn't have to fight for, but we do, and we were fortunate enough to at least win baseline protections for us going forward.
Can you give us a sense of where you feel like the organizing agenda is right now? Do you feel like there's been some movement on some of these issues that you've been organizing around and in sort of raising education with, and kind of what are next steps, do you feel like? And is there anything that those of us who are in the room who are not in the union but are in solidarity with you, what else can we do to be of service to what you feel like the demands are right now?
I think it's already happening. I mean, the Me Too movement is massive. It's just, we are stronger together, and nobody has to deal with this on their own, and so many times people feel like they have to, or they don't want to report it because they don't want that this happened to them. So I think the basis of it is just we all have to be there for each other and just move forward, especially in a society like it is today. I feel like everybody has something, and we just all need to come together and fight it as a whole instead of trying to deal with it on our own.
And now I just want to open it up for the panel a little bit. If there are other kind of points or issues that you feel like you want to raise or be able to have in the audience's ear before we open it up for Q&A, I'd love to kind of give you a minute to share a reflection or a point or whatever it is you feel like is on your mind or on your heart.
So this is something I learned during the strike, and we talked about it when we were standing over there in the corner, which I didn't realize, but I was asked to be on WBUR to talk about the strike and what was going on, and all of a sudden in the conversation I realized something that I had been doing was actually costing union jobs, which is we all go into hotels these days, and some of the more fancier upscale ones give you the choice of whether to change your towels or your sheets daily or whatever, and actually that's a way to cut workers. It's really got nothing to do with being green, and it's sold so well, right, that I fell for it, and then on the radio, I was like, I got church, right? I got religion, I got school, whatever you want to call it. I was like, oh damn, I've been a part of that, right? So maybe talk just a little bit about that, right, from your perspective, because it was an eye-opener for me.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I also have a thought on some of the things around OSHA and stuff like that we've used. But yeah, so the most egregious version of this is Marriott's. Well, it used to be called Make a Green Choice, and now it's called something Your Choice, right? Your choice, not anybody else's. They have great branding. So it's a program where you can forego hotel housekeeping because it's good for the environment, right? Because then you're not going to get your sheets, changed. You're not going to get your towels changed. And what it has done in the industry is actually decimate good jobs, because it's reduced the number of housekeepers who need to work on a given basis, on any given day. But secondly, it's put many, many housekeepers into on-call positions where they don't know if they're going to work from one day to the other, because they don't know if the guest will choose this or not, because it's sort of sold at the front desk, basically. And it's really a greenwashing program, because we actually did a bunch of information requests from the company during bargaining, and the environmental impact is marginal. I mean, things like LED certification of existing buildings that aren't certified would be a far better use of trying to figure out how to reduce the carbon footprint of a hotel, but of course the cost of that is extremely high versus the cost of having fewer housekeepers work on a given day. And so that's something that we've been campaigning on, and it's something we're actually continuing to campaign on. We did win some changes to the program through our bargaining, but it's not done yet, and there's more work to be done. I mean, another thought I had, just kind of trying to bring things together here, is occupational safety, occupational health, like how workers interact with their environment. And one of the things that we have spent a lot of time thinking about in the service industry, particularly with hotel housekeepers, is how does repetitive stress injury of doing the physical labor. I mean, one thing we often say is, go try to make 16 or 17 beds a day, and then try to clean the room and clean the bathroom that many times. And just think about what that would do to your body, right? Doing it once is pain enough, right? Trying to get your kids to do it once is hard enough, right? Imagine doing it that many times. And that physical stress and strain is real. We've actually had folks, come in from the academic community to work on that. And that's actually something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about and campaigning on. And we've also tried to do it in the context of some of these legal frameworks that you were talking about that have been sort of developed from trying to figure out how can we use that. It is a bit of a legacy of the history of industry that has actually now come into our world and something we think about. So.
First of all, I'm going to say I always change my towels. I do. It's just anytime I'm in a hotel, absolutely. $400 a night for a hotel room, yes, I will take new towels. Thank you. No, I was just thinking when Courtney was talking about South Boston, of course, this takes place in the North End. My dad and his whole family grew up in the North End. I never lived there. They had moved by that time. But same issue in the North End, which in 1919 was probably about 98% Italian. So about a small pocket of Irish was still there, a small pocket of the Jewish population was still there, very, very few, but it's almost all Italian. Now the North End's maybe 35% Italian, roughly, so if there's an Italian enclave, it's in the North End, but for some of the same reasons that Courtney was saying about South Boston, it's, you can't afford to live there. It's very, very difficult, very expensive. I have a good friend who owns a 3-family house in the North End that his dad had owned, and he was saying his dad used to get $77 a month rent, and now he gets $3,200, and he said same square footage, same exact rooms, but this is pretty amazing in the North End. And if you ever talk to old timers from the North End, they're shocked. This was a tenement neighborhood, really a poor tenement neighborhood, and people talk about being able to afford the North End now, very, very difficult. So I was just thinking of that parallel, Southie and the North End, very similar in that regard.
I think we can open it up now. Erica, is there a mic you want to bring out for the crowd out here? If there are questions, we can start to take some. We can open it up, and the floor is open.
I am a member of a nonprofit organization that is whose mission is to educate the newer generations in technical trades, welding, construction trades, welding, carpentry, trades that there are fewer and fewer people that are experienced in it. Sewing trades, tailors, seamstresses, that kind of thing. So I was wondering how do you ensure the quality of the environment in a nonprofit organization as far as safety and hazardous materials? And are they under the same rules as places that have employers? This place is mostly, there's only 2 employees and everybody else is volunteers or members.
Well, it depends on the materials that you'd be using, but if you're using solvents, chemicals, things that are on a variety of occupational safety and health administration lists, there are a lot of substances that have what are called material safety data sheets on them, and if they say this is how this is supposed to be used, exposures are supposed to be limited to a certain amount of time, you're supposed to have a respirator, whatever those things are, pretty much everybody should be going by them. The problem now is, and I don't want to say this in such a way that it means that I'm going to let you off the hook, but OSHA has been cut back so much, and the number of people doing inspections and things are gone down so low over the past 20, 25 years that the odds that somebody might ever come check on you are probably really slim. But again, that's not to let you off the, that's
well,
not.
I think one of the issues is that we have a lot of different disciplines within the same
Yep.
space. And so, disciplines that don't create fumes or don't create hazardous things or don't use hazardous things are mixed in with places that do, and
But some do,
trying
yeah.
to balance all that. But it tends to be the more industrial trades that are more that help us more financially. So we're trying to make that get that balance going, so we don't lose the collaboration either. So okay, thank you.
First off, thanks to all the panelists. Really interesting stuff. Stephen, you hit upon something which is often not known or talked about when it comes to the molasses flood, which is that the molasses in that tank were being used to make weapons. And so what I'd love to hear from you and the other panelists is, how does that fact shed light on how Massachusetts today remains deeply embedded and complicit with the defense industry and the war economy, and that also includes many of our academic institutions here as well?
I would say yes. What can I say? So molasses was a war-protected industry. Yes, it was the raw material that was used in the production of munitions. It goes from molasses to industrial alcohol to what's used in the sort of blasting mechanism, if you will, of some of the high explosives, nitroglycerin and TNT. Yeah, I think Massachusetts has been involved frequently in the defense industry, right? I live in Weymouth, back in the war years, South Weymouth was a huge, naval air base. Places like MIT and Lincoln Labs and all of that, very highly involved in the kind of war stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily drawing a judgment there. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but it sounds like you do. So I'm happy to hear you. I don't know what else to say about that.
I'm just curious to hear the thoughts of the panel, because that is something that's very present in Massachusetts and that we don't often talk about. And regardless of one's opinions on the matter, how can that shed light on how that continues to be an important role in our economy today? And of course, there's moral questions that come with that.
I mean, coming from UMass Lowell, I can comment on what I know happens there, and how university administrations deal with this question is not thinking necessarily about what it is that we're getting research money for. It's just that we're getting research money. And so for lots of colleges and universities, that's what drives research. And because we're in a country, sadly, where social research, where research on how do you figure out how to make neighborhoods more vibrant, how do you figure out how to create situations where people who live in Southie don't have to leave, those sorts of things, that's not the research that drives university budgets. And so university presidents and chancellors look the other way. And I agree with you, it's definitely a function in Massachusetts. More often than not, colleges and universities' biggest research budget comes from the Department of Defense or from some other sector of the military-industrial complex, whatever we want to call it. And so again, like some of the issues that were brought up this evening about hotel work, repetitive strain injuries and things like that, there might be a $25,000 grant or a $50,000 grant to go somewhere to study that, whereas there'll be a $25 million grant at UMass Lowell to come up with a high-tech battlefield. And until my take on this is until we figure out a way that the budget priorities are shifted, and so that's obviously organizing work and a campaign. But sadly, we're far away from, I think, making that happen. I can't be any more optimistic than that.
The gentleman before me kind of front ran my question. That was pretty much exactly what I was going to ask. But I'd like to add that these government demands is driving these companies to do these sort of profitable enterprises, and that there's things like machine learning and AI that are a little bit more nefarious, and that these corporations like Microsoft or Amazon might be working on these things, and the workers may not even know that they're doing something for the Department of Defense until they find out later. And that, like last Friday, many Microsoft employees signed a letter asking Microsoft to end contracts with the U.S. Army that were explicitly about increasing lethality. And with the global nature of these companies, these economies, it's conceivable that workers could be designing something that kills their coworkers or their coworkers' families.
When we're talking about labor and everything like that, we've touched on the fact that the people doing the work, the laborers that were killed when the tanks exploded. But on the flip side of that, you've got, would you people like to talk anything about like the history of like the profit motive? Because the case did come up later on, and where that goes with the owners, the employers, that type of thing, and the people who have to clean up the mess, because they're labor too.
Yeah, so I mean, the company does offer a defense. They offer the defense that the anarchist movement was very violent and very active in Boston at the time, and they offered the defense that an anarchist had put a pipe bomb down one of the vent pipes that's in the roof of the tank, and that it caused the explosion, and that they should be absolved of all liability. That's kind of the defense they put forward. Now, the judge in the case here's this evidence, or lack of, here's the case, and says you put on a very good argument, but you were missing one thing, and that's evidence, that there was no evidence of a bomb, no evidence of a concussive explosion. So he dismisses that as as that argument. But the company does make that argument as a way to sort of absolve itself of liability. So that's one point. The cleanup is massive, and so the cleanup is done by a combination of firefighters, Boston DPW personnel, and company employees. It takes a long time, maybe a couple of weeks, before the company finally responds, and they finally bring on about 500 employees to help with the cleanup. Most of the cleanup, there's a lot of confusion about how it's going to be cleaned up because the molasses congeals so quickly. Very viscous, very thick. They try municipal water, hooking up their hoses to a hydrant. It doesn't do much good. And finally, it's a firefighter, enterprising firefighter, who suggests that maybe salt from Boston Harbor, the brine, will cut that molasses, and they'll be able to wash it away. And that's exactly what happens. They pump millions of gallons of salt water from Boston Harbor and wash the molasses, much of it back into the harbor. The harbor is stained brown for months after. I did have somebody at one of my presentations ask me how long would the cleanup have taken had there been an EPA in 1919. But that's how most of the cleanup was done. And the buildings across the street from the tank, whose basements filled all the way up to the first floor, were pumped out. There were, I'd say, crude hydraulic pumps of the day that allowed the basements to be pumped out. Is it?
And so, we're then talking about how the inputs of labor and everything like that. And the firefighter is now somebody who's a frontline worker, and how they respond to working conditions. And so we can then go to more current, how the people who are actually doing the job respond to these crises.
Sure. I think one of the challenges of this kind of any kind of work that people are doing in this, I know mostly about the service sector, but that ultimately, if you don't have real representation and you don't have an ability to bargain and to be in a union or to be into some kind of organization where you can actually make the demands that were alluded to before, that people are, I think, very prone to be exploited, right? And very prone to basically just take whatever is given by the boss. And I think one of the things that, just thinking about some of the health and safety issues that we were talking about before, that, we encounter when we organize hotel workers, is that in a non-union context, people don't know the basic rules, regulations, and protections that they have. They may have sat through a training they didn't understand. It was often in a language that they don't speak. But, And even if you do speak it, often it doesn't make any sense. But people don't actually understand and know about those protections. And I know this is something the Firefighters Association has thought about a lot over the years historically and things like that. But there is a real relationship, I think, between worker organization and workplace health and safety. And I think that's something that I've seen in my work for years.
So I have a sort of a two-part question, one from the historical side, one for kind of the modern union side. Obviously, one of the reasons the tank was built in that location was because there was no expectation that there was no expectation when the tank was built that there would be any kind of local community outpour or ability for the immigrant community to protest this industrial tank being built. And by the 1960s, you start to see the environmental movement, people protesting industrial plants and so forth. But I'm wondering, closer to the collapse of the tank, were there any increases in local communities or immigrant groups starting to realize that this is something they can speak about? And then for the more modern perspective, obviously no one wants a 5-hour commute. And the service industry, as you said, is critical to these industries that then in turn push out the workers. Is there any recourse or ability for unions or specific union action directed towards affordable housing or specifically workers' abilities to actually work in the same communities where they would then live?
So I'll take the early part, and one of these esteemed panelists can take the latter part of your question. So the tank is really, you're right about one reason the tank is put there is because there is this feeling there'll be very little neighborhood resistance, and there was very little, almost no resistance. The other, of course, is it's a great location. So it's at Boston's Inner Harbor. It's about 220 feet from the harbor where the big molasses steamers would come up and offload their cargo, right? So it's a great geographic location, but also, you're right, most of the Italians who lived in the neighborhood at the time were not active. I mean, there's anarchists, Italian anarchists, a small handful that are. But most of the Italians that live in the neighborhood at the time are not kind of socially active. They mistrusted and distrusted government from the old country. Italians take a long time, unlike the Irish, the Italians take a long time to become politically active. Their loyalty is to the different regions from where they came, so they don't even identify as Italians, say as a voting bloc, until they come to America, right? That's kind of the irony of Italian immigration, I think. So there's not much in the way of activism at that time from the Italian community. I think it's, even after the flood, I think, you see a couple of days of outrage, and I think that's even true from the Boston political hierarchy, right? You see a couple of days of outrage from the mayor, Andrew Peters, from Honey Fitz, who's the congressman in that district still. But after that, very quiet. You're right about that. So for the modern day stuff, we'll turn to.
I mean, I want to, so quickly, I would think something like Flint and bad water is somewhat of an equivalent in the sense of it being presented as the collapse of something, right? And something that people take for granted, which is that they can drink water out of their tap living in a community where they're paying taxes and whatever, right? And so there's a good sort of contemporary example of still how far we have to go. And if you got a map out, if you went home with your computer or you did it on your phone, and you looked at where all the EPA sites are, where all of the high-end, really horrific toxic waste dumps are in the United States, the majority of them are going to be either on Native American lands or in the neighborhoods and the land of persons of color, and that's irrefutable. And so that's not an accident. The same way the tank was sited where it was sited because they weren't going to put it in Brookline, or Newton or Beacon Hill. They could have put it on Beacon Hill. They didn't, right? The same way they could put a toxic waste dump, in a really tony high-end suburb in Weston or whatever, right? But they wouldn't, right? And so to some extent we're somewhat more aware, but at the same time, this historical, environmental, racism, whatever word you want to use for it, persists. And again, all you have to do is open up and look at where the toxic waste dumps are.
I think the thing, I think it is economics. I think that's one really important piece, right, is how much are people really getting paid, right? Are they getting paid a wage to allow them to live in the city that they live in? I think the other piece of it, which I think gets at the affordable housing, is something that was brought up earlier, which is what are these industries solving for, right? And I think that's a really important question. That was, I think, at a sort of theoretical level, the question we tried to ask during the strike, the national strike of the merit workers. The reason we went out and said one job should be enough is because they're certainly not solving for that, right? They're not solving for people to be able to live and work in the same community, right? These industries, our industry, the hotel industry, that's what I know the most about. I know a little bit about food service, but in the hotel industry is a real estate industry, really, number one, right? Because these hotels are worth a fortune. And then number two, it's a service provider of hotel rooms. And those two things create large, the real estate part of it is, all these private equity firms, some of the biggest capital investments in the world, and own these properties in the city of Boston. And then the companies have increasingly consolidated. So you have a company like Marriott has 6,800 hotels worldwide, and all of them are not trying to solve for how do our workers live in our community. That's not even in the register of what they're thinking about solving for. And I think until working people and people in the communities and people who are affected by the crisis of affordable housing start to stand up and demand that developers, demand that individuals who own and operate these industries in these large-scale cities start to try to solve for different things, it's going to stay the same, because the weight on the other side, which is, for a Blackstone or for, a State Street, is to solve for what finance capital wants, which is not people living in a vibrant community where people can send their kids to college and, live near their workplace and have good public transit. And so until those questions start to get asked over and over again, I think, frankly, in the streets and in a militant way, some of which we tried to do, I don't think you're going to get to a different solution, right? You're not going to litigate your way to a different solution.
Hello, thank you guys for being here. I just wanted to first have like a social comment. I moved here in 2007 and I was in a 3-bedroom apartment. We're all paying $600. I was like, oh, that's so much money, I can barely afford it. I went back recently and spoke to that landlord who never painted, never fixed anything, garbage disposal didn't work, bathroom was a mess, all of that. He's charging $3,300 now for my old place. And I don't know how we're gonna solve anything, but because my income hasn't really changed a whole lot in the last 7 years. But anyway, my question really going back to Molasses flood was about the settlement that happened. And so I'm assuming that in that period before they came to the settlement, the families got nothing, right? And also, was it comparable for their loss of life, or just a commentary on like if you think that was fair. And then I also just wanted to say I heard that one of the reasons for the explosion was the difference in temperatures. You had mentioned it was like a 2-degree day prior to that, and then the other shipment of molasses that came in from the south was hotter, right? I just wanted to confirm that, and then also the settlement question.
Yeah, so the settlement, the families did get a settlement. So the judge in the case, Hugh W. Ogden, who I think really adjudicates this case in a very fair manner, does award damages to the 119 plaintiffs. He awards for people who died instantly. There were people who died instantly. He awards about $6,000, which would be about $600,000 today. These aren't large awards. I mean, one of the things he does talk about is that these are people of the working class. They weren't going to make a lot of money in their lifetime, which is still how damages are issued, right? That's one of the factors. And for those who suffered before they died, like George Leahy, who's the firefighter that's under the firehouse, The award was about $7,500, so same thing, about $750,000. So the plaintiff's lawyers are really happy with the decision. They're not so happy with the results. They threatened to take the company before a jury, which they have the right to do. They go behind closed doors, and they settle for about twice as much as the original awards. So if you just double those awards to $12,000 and $15,000. So the total award that the company ends up paying damages is about $628,000. That's for the plaintiffs that were injured, and the two biggest plaintiffs are the City of Boston for the DPW yard and Boston Elevated, which operated the passenger train overhead that went from South Station to North Station, which its main support trestle was severed by the molasses and by a piece of the tank. So that's the settlement story. I wouldn't say the weather had a lot to do with the collapse. However, what does have a lot to do is the molasses that's in the tank is cold, as you're correct about that. The new molasses that comes up, and it was about 700,000 gallons that filled it up to the 2.3 million. The new molasses that gets pumped into the tank is pumped into the bottom of the tank, and it is warm to allow it to flow from the ship to the tank. When that warm molasses mixes with the cold molasses, there is a fermentation process. There are vent pipes at the top that are supposed to allow the gas to escape. But sometimes the cold molasses acted as a tamp, because that intake pipe was at the bottom, acted as a tamp and put a lot of pressure on the outside walls. That's ultimately what causes this tank to collapse. Now, the reason the pressure on the outside walls is too much is because the tank is built in a very shoddy fashion, right? The steel is delivered, it's thinner than the specifications call for, the construction's not done well. So that's really scientifically the reason for the collapse. Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome.
Is there somebody upstairs? Oh, you do too? Okay.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So, current event question. I think right now Stop and Shop union workers are kind of on the verge of strike. I don't know if they've quite voted yet. But sort of pairing that with what happened with the gas explosions in, I think it was the Merrimack Valley, if I got that correct, just north of Boston. A lot of those gas explosions happened apparently because the scabs that were brought in were underskilled to deal with what was going on, since the company had locked out all of the actual union workers. A lot of the Stop and Shop employees are scared that they're going to be locked out of Stop and Shop. My question to the panel is, what do you know currently about the situation at Stop and Shop? Could you briefly describe what a lockout is? Because I'm not entirely sure how that works to combat what a strike is. And a comment to the audience: if Stop and Shop workers do go on strike, please don't cross the picket line.
It's a different union. So I don't know the details of exactly where things are at in terms of the bargaining. I know they have authorized a strike action. In other words, action up to and including a strike. That's usually a vote of the membership, but that they're still negotiating and that there's no strike been called yet. That is the extent to I know the current where things stand. So a lockout is sort of the opposite of a strike. It's sort of the easiest way of explaining it. A lockout is when the employer decides that that they are not going to allow union workers to come to work, therefore locking them out of the building, which is actually their right under the law to do so in negotiations. So that's. Yeah, that was National Grid. Yeah, National Grid was a lockout situation. So it's an employer tactic that is used.
I have a question. So I just wondered if any of you have any thoughts on. It seems to be in the news a lot lately. It's in part because of the popularity of that recent film Roma, the whole topic of domestic workers and domestic worker organizing. And I just was thinking about just and kind of thinking about the workplace and then kind of moving us to the private space and the home as another workspace, as part of our, our environment and our community and our lifestyle as a society. If you have any thoughts on kind of what's going on today in terms of domestic worker organizing and how that might fit in or not fit in with some of the other organizing that's going on.
I have one thought on domestic workers and people who do work in the home. One of the things that there was a recent Supreme Court decision called Janus, which is very bad, which applies to public sector workers, basically making the entire public sector right to work, which undermines the strength of unions. One of the unsaid impacts of this and related impacts of this is that there has actually been a number of attempts to organize home healthcare workers and certain kinds of domestic workers that are being totally undermined right now in this country in an organized way by folks who are friends with Donald Trump. So I think it's a really contested sphere, actually, and I know there's great organizations like the Domestic Workers Alliance and different organizations who do a lot of work on this, and this is also a major international issue. It's a major issue that's being discussed a lot at different, at a multinational level, because there's a lot of cross-border issues that are at stake. There's a whole set of things that have come up. It's not something that we have worked on directly, but obviously it's something that we have supported because of the communities that are the workers who work in the more traditional, the conventional economy actually work in. And this sort of question of precarious work, which I think exists in sort of informal economies that exist both in this country and around the world, I think is one of the most important issues that need to be addressed, because a lot of these, both in the United States and elsewhere, there are very little rights and very few recourse that individuals can have if they're working in a domestic situation. And so I think it's something that really needs to be a top priority, not just here, but internationally in terms of of labor, because there's more and more of this kind of work. So.
One of the provocative things about the comparison of the 1919 to the 2019 period is that you're talking about labor, and labor in 1919 probably meant something different from labor in 2019. Back then, I would say that it probably wasn't a pressure group concerned only about work conditions and wages and hours, but had a different political vision, an alternative political vision. And when I look at your book, The Dark Tide, I see two types of Italians emerge. Either they're very inward-looking, very family-bound, dominated by the church, or they're completely the opposite, radical anarchists ready to explode at any time. How did the Italian community and the workers themselves respond to this tragedy that affected their community? How did the anarchists respond, bearing in mind that at the same time they were being deported and subject to massive political repression, and also that the 1919 period, obviously in world history, was a period when there were alternatives for labor on a bigger scale than a new collective bargaining framework or anything like that?
Wow, that's a mouthful. So I would say this is a period of time where it's just before I would say the great labor movement, which is, I think Bob points out, in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s is when it really starts. However, 1920, 21, 22, right in that period, you're still having lots of debates around the country about worker safety. So this is around the time of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, about the Chicago meat packing plants, just a couple years after. I think that's 24 or 25, if I'm correct. Yep. So it's just before, I would say, what we know is the great labor movement, right? Which doesn't happen until really the Depression, kind of spawns that. So in terms of organization, I would say not a lot of organization, if that's the essence of your question. In the Italian neighborhood, as I said, Not at all. So Italians were, and I know this from my family history, I know this from all the research I've done on the Italian immigrant community. Italians spend a lot of time working very, very hard at very, very low-level jobs, right? Unskilled laborers, pick and shovel laborers. My grandfather sold bananas off a pushcart in Haymarket Square. So that's the kind of jobs that a lot of Italians were doing at that period of time. Work was important to them, and home ownership was important to them. So their goal was to own property, to buy homes. Sometimes they sacrificed education for that. The older children of Italian immigrants often left school in the 9th grade, 10th grade, that kind of thing, to go to work to help the family purchase a home. That was the one thing that could never be taken from you. Most of them didn't own in Italy, right? They worked land in Italy. So owning a piece of property was very, very important here. So this notion that there was this widespread kind of activism among the Italian peasant community in 1919 is really a myth. It just didn't happen. The anarchist movement, as I said, very active, very violent. I am not a big, the Italian anarchist movement had as its de facto national headquarters Boston's North End. So these are Sacco and Vanzetti's comrades. I am not a big Sacco and Vanzetti fan. I am not a Sacco and Vanzetti romanticist or apologist. They were bad guys, and their colleagues were bad guys. Now, I don't think they got a fair trial. I think you can hold both of those points of view. My opinion is that Sacco was probably guilty of the murders in South Braintree and Vanzetti was probably innocent. Just my opinion. I've read enough about it to be able to draw an opinion on it. So the anarchist movement, I think, was 180 degrees away from your average Italian immigrant in the way they behaved. So one was very kind of family-oriented, keep your head down, work hard, hang out with your paese on the corner or at the social club, lots of social clubs from the different paeses. And one was, one were active anarchists, a very small percentage were active anarchists. So does that answer your question? Does that help with that? Or? Yeah, no, the question, so you're right, 200,000 people line the streets for Sacco and Vanzetti's funeral from the North End to Forest Hills, which is where they're buried. Yeah, no, there's no question. I think Italian immigrants at the time viewed a lot of the oppression of Sacco and Vanzetti, or the lack of a fair trial, right, was due mostly to their Italianness. I kind of split it 50-50. I say 50% of it was their Italianness and 50% of it was their anarchist. The judge in the case, Webster Thayer, is the judge in the case, makes comments about both their ethnicity and their anarchist behavior. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I think the Italians in that moment, in that time, those two were folk heroes to them. No question about that. Yeah. Great question. Great, several questions.